concerning the nature of the fundamental mechanism by which wrongdoing is made possible in the world, which we simply call equivocation. The nature of that mechanism, in other words, why that mechanism happens, the cause of the mechanism, is the next thing to be addressed, because without knowing the causes of these things, we are not equipped to deal with them, because then we're only dealing with the results, and we're never dealing with the process that creates the results. So in order to exercise agency over the domain of events in our world, a person must understand that world and must therefore come to grips with the causes of the phenomena in the world. So the mechanism of equivocation, understood axiologically, has fundamental characteristics that recur in both form and content that can be reiterated and explicated in many ways, but the most fundamental principle, and let me just say this is more of a heuristic principle that can be applied to the discussion for the longest term benefit, is something that is always good advice in general, which is, of course, it's put in two different ways, but in general, the buyer beware is the, so Emptor, caveat, Emptor, I think is the, and that's often approximated into, as far as usage, just like into English in a certain idiom, just like c'est la vie is from the French, and we take that to mean different, we can interpret that in different ways depending on how we use it. The way this is often, one way that this is often used is in the context of making sure that you're responsible for the way you respond to conditions, and you're responsible for making decisions about what you decide to make decisions about. You're responsible for deliberating in the realm of your own experience and then responding to it. If you don't give a response that can be called rational, it's because in essence either that nature was not in you, or you did not choose to duly and diligently activate it and use it, so you were culpable for that. And these things can all be somewhat understood in codes of ethics and law based upon the development of the organism of the person in this world, their body, and that can be assessed for answering the question as to degree of culpability and complicity in any type of event that may be considered good or evil. But overall, the pinnacle of to each his own is that there is something to which each is of his own self responsible. One adds something, and one is responsible for something in any given set of circumstances. One can take agency over those circumstances, or else one is not a responsible, agental person. One is not an agent. One is not a person, really, if that's not true. That's part of the essential definition of what it is to be a person. So a person should probably be aware of the fact that no matter what circumstance they're in, no matter whether it is presented to them on false pretexts or not, whether they are sucked into it by circumstances of fate and serendipity, or whether it was contrived and organized just to appear that way, or regardless of appearances, a person has to still make decisions about how they relate to these events as they ensue. I mean, it's just, it's never not the case that someone is not responsible for something. So, in fact, each individual someone who is a person is always responsible for something, including actualizing their own nature. Now, in a world where we have sayings like this, buyer beware in English would be one way to put that. But basically, it means to. In fact, let's get the exact Latin on it, which I happen to have forgotten. And let's put it into English. And that should be Latin. English. Well, see, because it's a term in English, we're not going to get the. It's an idiom, and of course it translates into "let the buyer beware." But I know that can't be the primitive Latin meaning, and of course I mean primitive in its broadest sense. So that's the thing with Google Translate. It sometimes just goes right into the essential translation that you're doing. Well, basically, it's similar to also sold as is, but of course that's why buyer must beware. But in fact, it says, may he beware, is what it says. So generally, and I am using Wikipedia. I mean, it's very it's consistent enough on these types of topics. It's a contract law principle that controls the sale of real property after the date of closing, but may also apply to sales of other goods. It arises from the fact that buyers have less information about a good or a service, while the seller has more information. That's always a possibility that you're encountering. And the quality of this situation is, of course, known as information symmetry. That's right. And I know of some who are absolutely against information asymmetry, and given the things I know about in the world these days, I tend to agree with them. I used to be more laissez-faire about those types of things. There may be defects in a good or a service that may be hidden from the buyer, but are known only to the seller. And instead of a seller always being at risk of being improperly impugned for that, because sometimes it's not their fault, because they might have done due diligence to make sure they exposed everything about the product. But if they have tested it and used it, and they've exposed every defect in it, and to the best of their ability, they have honestly done this, it's certainly not right that they be later accused and be held strictly liable for the whatever faults are found later. And so they will say sold as is, what you see is what you get, and they also say let the buyer beware. But really, the original Latin is may he beware, and that's a warning. So this is a warning, and here's another warning. And this is something that should be common sense, but really most people don't follow it in certain ways, whereas they over-focus on it in others, and then there are many discrepancies in human norms and mores and standards of conduct, both publicly and just at large and within the framework of certain institutions, be they private or public, secret or open. And by the way, I don't define secret as evil in itself, but but we'll get to that. On a metaphysical level, it can be considered that way if it is used to cover over evil, which so therefore it is a select attribute to look for when hunting down wrongdoers, is that they keep secrets about it. So there'll be a deformity in the information fields around that being in the teleological space of basically any experiences they have with other beings who also have agency and conscience. And they'll be found out because things that should have just been revealed or disclosed casually will be done so only guardedly, or things will be presented and given too much of a spotlight, and hence represent an inflation of disclosure so as to depreciate an interest in another area of their life, things like that. When people are like that, you can get a feeling through that, which tells you if it's just them being private, or if it's just, or if they're actually maybe for you, not someone that you want to accompany any further into fate or destiny of any kind. In a free world, this would be the case. And really that is spoken to us by the very essence of these warnings. So mistake not the Signum for the Signatum, or to use a cruder English, mistake not the Signum for the Signatum, but that Signum and Signatum, the way the Latin language pronounces it. Mistake not the Signum for the Signatum. But why would you ever be able to do this in the first place? That's because, as I said in the earlier video concerning senses of terms, that terms can be ambiguous to their in relation to their meanings unless assigned one or the other by some explicit means, such as by a modification to the term, or an enlarging upon its interpretation by a context, or by, as I also implied, an intuition about the essential meaning, which, in other words, there's a context and there is an assignation of evidence which are not restricted by the presentation. No matter how strictly liable the agent is for that presentation to be the way that it is, or no matter by what methodology or for what reason. So the causes of equivocation are key to understanding the causes of living in a world where these kinds of warnings carry a lot of weight. And there isn't a single moral fable which could consider itself to have presented a worthier topic for its plot than these. And I'm sure Aesop's fables couldn't come up with a better one. I believe that the fox wearing the sheep's wool is exactly in that line. So these are the basic ideas to, basically you should, if you're truly interested in getting at the truth and being true to what is right, instead of being the kind of lying, cheating, filthy, scumbag pimps and whores that work in secret societies so as to defame good people on their own for their own purposes, in a sort of psychological warfare operation, class warfare done covertly and hence very much illegally and against all public authority. In that case, you have to be hiding what you're doing and doing it under false pretext, keeping it secret so that the public doesn't see your wrongdoing and punish you. It's a very select form of criminal activity, which happens whenever public institutions become thoroughly corrupt. But you know it, because, as Plato said, that's the case where the perfectly unjust rules the world, and therefore you have a worst case scenario for that world, where those who are guilty of the worst crimes just so happen to also have the most power to perform them, and at the same time are least likely to be blamed for such things. And they often find the people who are least likely to be involved in such things, and who are of the best character, the most fitting scapegoats for their distraction campaign that they run upon society. And this, however, is a very deliberate action, a very systematic action, It is the highest treason against any society, in any world, by any contract, by any means. If they have any honor in their system, it is an absolute condemnation of those who are doing these things in that system. They should be considered enemies of the state and of society and of the public. But if a society is, of course, too systematically corrupt for that to take place, because it is this way, systematically, and through its major institutions of authority, so that the public is officially corrupt, in fact, then you have a very severe problem, because that civilization cannot stand, because it will, by nature, devolve into civil war. That's another thing that Plato brought out in the Republic. It's worth a read. But when understood in terms of the principal essences by which beings change in a world where ambivalence is true, that has to be understood in a specific way, so that the evolution of these inevitable results of corruption in social institutions and in society as such, and in people as such, can be understood properly. Better change this here, because it's not quite allowing that to be the case. But, like I said, I really like the contrast. I don't like the way this works here. So production values have just dropped, but as you know, in order to speak freely and not move down the slippery slope of reducing content to form, can often be found to disregard such things. And I'm very frank about that for a reason. Well, I think it might just be the brightness and the angle being different than before. So, a quick shift. Well, let's hope that doesn't continue to be the case so much as I make more markings on the board here. So basically, in a world where that kind of systematic corruption exists, you have to understand the devolution of society into sub-societies or classes or castes as being a natural symptom of that, and the struggles between them will involve asymmetric information working to a maximum to the advantage of one side against the other. In many cases, one will take the initiative against the other, and it will be the one that has more power concentrated in its hands already. And that's the historical fact of the matter, whether you like it or not. And any study of political science and the history of power will reveal this. Just any honest and open study of those subjects will reveal it. It's not disputed. If it's disputed by someone, you're dealing with an ignorant idiot, or you're dealing with somebody who knows the subject and is literally trying to pull the wool over your eyes, like right in front of your face. Basically, it's a known fact that these kinds of struggles for power exist only when the interests at stake are such that they lead to a symptom in society whereby covert activities take place in one group designed to cripple the power of another group in ways that are done in a concerted effort that goes even beyond politics as conventionally displayed in party politics. Another conspiracy which is known to exist. But also they can go far deeper than that, and it depends on the degree of technological advantage that one side has over the other. And when you see this externalized and projected out of one given society, you see it in the form of extremely asymmetrical warfare like found in Southeast Asia whenever attacked by Western and Eurasian forces in proxy wars. Those situations reveal that the asymmetrical warfare aspect will stop at no limit in order to either win or achieve an objective, which apparently wasn't winning in the case of Vietnam. At least not in the way that people conventionally understand warfare to take place. Apparently the war was lost on some other level. And it wasn't because of the forces that were arrayed, publicly known about being arrayed, that the war was lost. And it was because of tactics chosen partly in order not to push a brink too far. And the way that's negotiated is probably according to protocols understood under the theory of mutually assured destruction. But in the case of game theory, basically we have just more evidence of a zero-sum game being conducted between opposing sides. But as I've demonstrated earlier, the most fundamental zero-sum game theoretical conflict is the one that I discuss in terms of absolutes on a metaphysical scale, and that's important for understanding the logic of some of the things that I will be demonstrating later in the praxeology. And this is the bridge between those two. So to get back into the substance of it, the mistake is possible that you will confuse these two because you are not aware of the risk. You might not even know that this is even possible. You might think everything is as it appears. You might really believe that. Or you might believe there's always a benign interpretation for any dislocation between the sign and what is signified, so that you believe that the sign, for example, someone's public appearance as a figure of authority, and what is signified by that, the whole person, their private life, what they're really involved in secretly in terms of perhaps many greatly despicable activities, such as Jimmy Savile's pedophilic empire over the BBC, and perhaps many other similar human trafficking and abuse activities being conducted from the Vatican and from other institutions that are publicly respected by a whole lot of mind-controlled ants shaped like human beings, but also some confused people who are just ignorant and losing in the info war, as it were. The asymmetrical warfare conducted against them in those cases is very extreme because they take a sign of righteousness at face value, not realizing that it actually stands for an entity or a group of entities who are involved in actions that are the exact opposite of what that sign represents. You don't have to use a scenario involving body snatchers or body cloners or mind-controlling psychotronic warfare equipment or gaslighting scenarios involving game stalking to demonstrate that this can be done on an epic scale, because it's been recognized that this has been done on an epic scale throughout history. So getting into the matter of how this leads into the further understanding of the mechanism of equivocation is first to understand that equivocation is to confuse two different types of entities, two different types of senses, because you have one term that is used for either one, or can be used for either one. In other words, because deception is possible, you can recognize that a man who lies might wish to appear as anything but a liar. You might understand it's for an interest also. So now you understand the motive for this equivocation, where he appears as an honest man, but he is a liar. But his reputation and his ability to gain your confidence make him seem, as per the SOS diagram I did earlier, as the one thing rather than the other. But he is not this. He is the other. So the sign, the object in the middle between the two, which I diagram again, here is that, and here is the subject of our who properly can know such things and is looking for the proper interpretation of all the objects in their experience, and they expect to encounter a being or an essential result from their experience, which is consistent with how things appeared at a time earlier in experience, or with another part of their consciousness at the same moment with the experience. It depends on which way you're going psychologically, temporally, or in terms of historical events, or temporally in terms of the transmutation or transformation of consciousness. In the case where we don't have this actual result, then you have a different kind of force operating in an evil manner, negatively. And this is what's actually coming through, but it's going to come through under the radar. So that the isomorphy between these two is in the form that this has, which this also has, but which carries a different substance on the surface. But that's read either way by the subject as being the terms involved or the appearances involved. And the better that this evil being is at acting out the role, which must also be played for whatever reason by the genuine being, for whatever reason that is the case, for whatever reason, that's better. Whatever reason that is the case, the ideal result for the fraudulent being is to encase the mark. This would be the mark, not the mark as in a marking, but as in the person selected for a confidence trick by the con artist here, if you should call him an artist, by the charlatan, is selected based on their likely degree of gullibility, naivete, innocence, and so forth. It's also considered in terms of the risk of being caught and the values that are at stake. What's the bounty on this mark? What goods does he have? Right? Depends on who are the interested parties of this conspiracy, because this is a conspiracy. Now, at a very minimum, this is the father of all conspiracies of any kind, real or unreal. Doesn't matter. If you want the word to have meaning, you have to start somewhere, and it has to mean something at some time. Whenever this is the case, that that this is going on, and I'll let that stand for ambivalence at any stage of the cosmos, but after the beginning and before the end, the relation here requires that this being carry about a game of duplicity that will have the appearance of being one thing, and that's understood across the barrier, but this relation is actually the way that it operates. And there are different permutations of these two relations, which I'll demonstrate the mechanism of equivocation in its fundamental form through an explication, basically, of some rather thorny implications in the metaphysical structure of this, but which can be worked out in terms of understanding the basics, so that we can understand all the possible ways that a crime, a fraud, can be committed, and all the possible motives, all the possible methods, all the possible ways it would look in the world and try to cover its tracks, everything. Basically, the fundamental principles of the investigation of reality and of the investigation of crimes happen to have a lot in common. Basically, to get further into the details of that mechanism, which at outset is structured in a way that can look rather complicated, but in fact boils down to understanding the fundamentals of metaphysics, including eschatology, understood as the inevitability of justice, that the righteous behavior involved in understanding these realities, and which includes learning the truth and being a free speaker of the truth. I will tell you all the virtues that are at stake, because that is the next logical step in any event. Because the question for you is, you know this is real. You know this is the case in the world we live in, even if you take the most bare bones, status quo version of history and current events. Even then. Otherwise, you would not have movies about these things where it was plausible for you to spend $10 to suspend your ability to believe, that those are actors, and to suspend your disbelief that those things really blew up that way. Just to give a very crude example. So you must know that these ideas, because these are inherent. This is ancient wisdom in the world, and it doesn't go away. Hollywood can't wish it away. That's the fuel for plots. This is what reality fundamentally may be and is. So in fact, the only question that remains is, how bad is it? How far has it gone? How far gone is it? That's the only thing that's left to figure out. If we were to take the world and interrogate it, as Heraclitus should have done, and probably did, which is why he was so saddened by what he discovered, and that is that if we understand the world through the various means at our disposal in its fullness, and we thereby interrogate it to complete success, and we ask it the simple question, what did you know and when did you know it? And then we map that information onto all the actions we have seen in the world. Basically, if we completely integrate the subject and the object of the world's experience of itself into one whole, including with all agents involved, good and evil, liars and truth tellers, everyone. If we do that and integrate it into one final exposure of reality, and one that is intensified to its utmost accuracy and volume, the highest pitch of volume that it can obtain, to result in an ultimate moment of self-realization for the world. One mind, one being, all at once. Then it would lead to the answer. If we could get that done, then it would lead to the answer to the question of what kind of world we've been living in that whole time, and to what degree we may assess stages of its activity and their symptoms after a certain point in time as being of one nature or another, and so on, for every possible world whereby the world may be critically analyzed according to the events of significance that have affected people for good or for ill, whether petty and small and almost invisible in nature, all the way to the most cosmic in their implications. The Jainists knew this, which is why they were concerned about one part of that process, to purify themselves and remove themselves from evil. I mean, they made a judgment call on what world they were living in, and so did many other. So does every individual. Every individual must do this. To have one's right to take in all the information possible, therefore, and to make the best judgment possible, is to actually abrogate someone's rightful duty as a person with a conscience, and that is in itself the nature of evil, because only an evil person would seek to prevent someone from acting according to their best conscience and judgment with the most amount of information available to them, because the maximum ultimum of that is what people think of as God. So that means they are enemies of God by definition. It's not people are enemies of love. Love is by its nature is a transitive verb. There must be an object of love. It doesn't just happen meaninglessly. It's not a meaningless content. It's not magnetism. Even that has more meaning than love, apparently. There are properties to magnetism that cause them to come together. So basically, it is in the universes where this is possible, for sure, it must be love of truth, for only those who do not love truth would be willing to sustain and abide by a lie, which can only be for the sake of protecting one enemy from another. And in the world of absolute values, the only way there can be enemies is if one is absolutely good and one is absolutely evil. So therefore, in terms of all relative values, they can only be judged according to their degree of participation in the absolute values which ground them in being as such for an eternity, no matter under what conditions. So by metaphysical deduction, we can know that any permutations of judgment taking place for conflicts involving good and evil in principle, even if not in their ultimate forms, can be understood by the norms of human conduct, including mores, which lead to customs, which lead to laws, and so forth, and then the punishment of crimes. All these things can only be understood in a context in which, on an absolute scale, one side is absolutely just and the other is absolutely unjust, even if we sought justice as an ideal from which a deviation could be in any direction, and it were not polarized in the terms which I've described, although I would say that it is polarized in those terms. Unjust would be any slight deviation from the just. And since people prefer justice to injustice if they're honest, or at least they pretend to prefer them if they're dishonest, because no one has openly said justice is piss, injustice is the way to go, except Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus said it in the form of saying that justice is in the interest of the stronger, and he was, of course, one of the political plotters against Socrates that got him framed up as introducing new gods being a corrupter of youth. In other words, they accused him of being a terrorist, basically. And they forced him to commit suicide by hemlock because he wouldn't accept their ridiculous claims about him, which were obviously false by the facts and by his own knowledge of himself. But the political structure of Athens was corrupt enough at the time that it ended up costing him his life or his dignity and honor, because they also wanted to give him an out, it should be pointed out. They offered him means, or tempted him with the appearance of offering him means of escaping into exile anyway, after he said he preferred hemlock to exile. They first offered him exile formally, and then they still made it possible for him to escape secretly, and he refused to do it. So in other words, they're always entrapping the honest and condemning them. Look, I'll tell you what, there's never been a more honest man than Diogenes, probably. Diogenes of Sinope. I think it's pronounced Sinope. There's another situation where, buyer beware as to pronunciations, but it looks like Sinope to me. So Sinope. Oh, now it's Sinope. So they took the E off. Why was there an E on there in the first place? So going in and getting the pronunciation, perhaps. Nope. But here's the Greek, and it comes in that form, and that would be the proper pronunciation. Let's go to the translator. And what we find is Sinope. Figures. It's a silent E in English, but it's going to be a long E in Greek. Alright, so Sinope. So basically Diogenes of Sinope, he was a philosopher of great renown for good reason. He wasn't going to change his principles for anybody. That's real philosophy. Those who will not abandon their own mind and mentality to the arbitrary claims of someone who opposes them in bad faith can be called sane. Someone who employs facts and reason in a coherent and proper form, and then can demonstrate that those responsible for evaluating such presentations, as whether sane or not, have in fact misrepresented the person, and can demonstrate this empirically, are sane, which I can do. But I'm not going to do that now, but I will tell you that the means by which I would do it, the motive, and the method would involve uncovering the fraud which was being perpetrated by the contrary actions, which I would have to demonstrate by showing that, okay, there was a concerted effort to misrepresent the truth. But there can't be an understanding of any lie or any misrepresentation of the truth without understanding the basic principle which makes it all possible. Formally and mechanically, this possibility exists in the world, and the only question is, given the evidence, is how bad is it? How far has it gone? And the mechanism for being able to determine that would require omniscience if we were required to do so in a way that may not be possible in any given individual case, yet we have the capacity to understand absolutes and thereby can predict such an ultimate state of affairs. Therefore, we can look for signs of that ultimacy in the evidence at hand using reason according to the principles which Plato espoused rightly, which is what I do, and that's what I demonstrate, and that's why none of this is about me, because whether I'm here or not, or whether someone else is ever presenting the information is invariant, and the only question is, what is in the nature of the person receiving it, and what are they doing with it? That alone they're responsible for, and I can say again, let him beware, because how he treats this information, whether or not he opposes it covertly or overtly, secretly or openly, he confesses himself, if he opposes it, to be of an ambivalent nature. He knows he must operate covertly in order to hide the evil intentions that he has. He must hide from the public, and he must hide from the individuals that he targets. That's what criminals do. So in defining the criminal, I've defined the enemy of the state, whether from within or without. The Constitution specifies that it was a political intuition at the time, that its enemies can be anywhere at any time. Well, in what form would they exist except in the form that abrogates the principles of the Constitution as such, even if it pretends to be doing so for their defense, which is a self-contradiction, cannot be done. There are many ways to demonstrate it. It's not a question of could it be demonstrated. It's not an arbitrary claim. Of course it can be demonstrated. I'm demonstrating it now. But the fact remains then that it must be considered that this information is not to be taken lightly. And it is presented as is, and it is presented according to the evidence available to anyone who can visit a public library, use a basic school education, and having common sense, and even the most fundamental course in logic, so as to preserve it in reasoning, would be able to reach conclusions or understand the conclusions I reach, and if not able to do so, would be responsible for asking for clarification in their own mind or from some expert, and then having that clarification given, which should in the end result in a contradiction, if I'm wrong, based on my premises, and showing that I reached my conclusion invalidly. And if that can't be shown, then I've provided the reasons for my claims. So I've done the burden of proof, which isn't even mine. I don't have the burden of proof here. Not in reality, but according to the norms, many people being confused and ignorant of the matter may decide I have the burden of proof. Well, I can't force volumes of knowledge into the head of a person and make them know things and understand them. I can't run them through a channel of experience that isn't their own life already. So you've got all the experiences that you, by your own due diligence or lack thereof, have acquired. You've performed all the analysis and reflection that that the kind of person you are requires of it, so that you feel like you're living a good life and doing what's right. And so you're responsible. If you're an adult for all of that, I'm not. I don't claim to be. To each his own, I say, and that's one that you are well never to forget, and it is an ultimate truth. And I put that on here because it is simply true. And I abjure anyone who would oppose it as being evil. To each his own. You have no right to what is mine, and I have no right to what is yours. And frankly, I have no interest in what is someone else's. So, and I'm not giving you what is mine here. I'm giving the truth. The truth belongs to everyone. So it's not. At the same time, I'm making the demonstrations required. And that's important really just so that a person can deprogram themselves from deception. But you want to be sure about what you're looking at. There's parts of you that have been conditioned, if you're an honest person, that have been conditioned in spite of your honesty so as to work against your better judgment when trying to be honest, and will undermine you if possible, just from cognitive dissonance alone. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you don't have enough information, in this case, when you don't have enough information about all this going on to decide whether it's one way or the other. Therefore, you don't know how to interpret or act upon it. You ever smell a rat but not know it was actually a corpse buried under your house? Well, watch LA Confidential. LA Confidential is a whole lot about this. I'll put the link to the movie trailer in the video description below. But in fact, it's also in my Gnostic aesthetics section under, I believe, Gnostic cinema. But I definitely put a lot of trailers on there, in that some people don't approach things through the left hemispheric path of understanding, or may find it not to be, maybe too dry or insufficiently filled with examples or imagery that they can relate to. So art usually fills that void better than even everyday life, given the circumstances in which art is appreciated. One must be, again, careful about what kind of art you're indulging in order to have these experiences. But if you want an experience of things as I describe them in terms of a Gnostic philosophical analysis, then you would go into that series of videos and then look for the movie that seems to strike your intuition, study that movie just from your own state of mind, and then see passively, without even thinking about it, whether or not any principles I mentioned crop up in watching that film. Because instead of me going and presenting the analyses of all those films, which I was tempted to do and I started to do with They Live, and that requires another 3 or 4 layers of analysis. And I realized if I start going down that road and doing that right, it's gonna have 2 results. One, I'm gonna be spending all my time being a Gnostic interpreter of cinema, and the other, which could be a pleasurable pastime to spend all my spare time doing. But the other thing is, actually, it's going to become important to me to understand the mechanisms which underlie that. And as a philosopher, I can't just keep indulging in the wild abandon of my intuition. I have to check things, frame them, analyze them, see their mechanical truth in its ultimate form, and then sort of, as it were, perform due diligence with the functions of analysis. By so doing, I ensure to myself that I am a just person, and not merely someone who pleases his fancy. But at the same time, by having done this, which is the righteous path of all philosophers, in fact, then whenever I do enjoy an aesthetic experience, I know it is without guilt. That cannot be said for my enemies. The nature of reality as we live in here requires, I'm sure by now anybody watching this video or having come into contact with it is fully aware of the fact that the evidence of the world supplies us with the truth, that one must beware not to mistake the appearances of things for being prima facie evidence of what is actually, I mean, it is prima facie evidence in a trivial way because it's what is presented immediately. But these impressions underlie realities which may be very different from them through mechanisms of perception involved in what will amount to, as a result, an equivocation in which one may be taken for a ride, and you're going to lose in that ride, and the house will always win if it's systematic. That is a fact, because the systematic collusion of agents to reach one goal is exactly what a business or a corporation or any other type of society is, secret or not. So when it comes to the matters of criminal activity that is systematic, you know that if you would have been taken for a ride with, whether or not you're taken for a ride by any specific aspect of the process, on the whole, you will be the loser. So in other words, someone who goes into a casino and wins, that's always a scam, by the way. You don't just win. There's going to casino and win. There's a lot more that comes with that. But if you go into a casino and win, then you might think, oh, see, it's not designed to, look, I just won, so it's not taking advantage of it. Well, on the whole, everyone who goes into a casino doesn't get that experience. So on the whole, that class of people is the loser. You're the exception to the rule. In fact, you're a reminder to everyone that they're not you. That's how much of an exception to the rule that person is who wins the big jackpot. The house didn't lose because they made much more than that, using you as an example, what none of these other suckers are going to get. They're going to keep trying for. You got some, in fact, you just got some of their money, and you got a proportion of that rest of that group's money. The rest of the fools that go in there, proceeds from their foolishness, part of the proceeds go to one fool who's going to be considered really lucky. It's like a little religion they've got, and that's the donation plate. One fool will get wins. They're like the sacrifice, but in reverse. Everyone else is the sacrifice. Here's the only one that survives or is redeemed through it. That's what this world actually is. And then those people are the ones given authority. But those are made to go hand in hand. And where that's made not to look the case, and you're talking about one who's really a blessed fool, then that means that the structure of authority which provided that sideshow is the winner, the real winner. This is just a sort of a token winner for the losing group, and then the game goes on. And the show that never ends will end, however. But basically, because the equivocation can happen here in the object, and you can be deceived, you can have the need to perform further diligence in the matter, and look further and decide whether or not you want to shake that man's hand, or whether or not you want to live next door to that person on that property, or whether or not you want to believe that person has your best interests at heart, even though all claims and appearances support that. You have a feeling to the contrary, or a sense of something being out of place. Then you have the option to look further into it to force the matter so that you're sure which one it is. If you don't do that, that's a decision, and you're culpable for that, morally culpable, because of what risk that puts your own soul to, because you ceased being aware. You ceased being wary whenever, on some level, you knew you should have. And that's another way that they can get you. That's how confidence tricks work. In the end, they can make you feel guilty and ashamed for what you did when they scammed you. Sound like any particular systems of justice that you know of? Well, that's the system of misjustice, or just us, that is taking place in the world today, I argue. But in order to demonstrate that, I've had to look further into matters of fact and process those facts by more sophisticated paradigmatics of analysis. And so the heuristics involved in that too have had to increase so that I was able to differentiate good from bad information, false positives from true positives, and false negatives from true negatives, and so forth, and it goes on and on. But it's basically good old-fashioned analysis. And what I found is that there's a mechanism that is rather objective, and almost neutral to value, which enables this, or else this couldn't be possible, and therefore it would fall within this domain, so that the analysis of the signs themselves can give critical information about what is signified, and thereby, if able to do so, if the information were taken to an infinite degree, in other words, the topics of philosophy and religion, then of course, when properly attuned to the circumstances that they're analyzing, it could be brought down to a scale of just trying to figure out the facts of any particular ambiguity in life, or any particular cognitive dissonance, maybe whether you want to be a jazz musician or an engineer of some kind. And you don't have enough information to figure out what you want to be at that time, but you got to make a decision to pick a major. So you maybe try to figure out some way to get enough information about one that if you, for example, then turn it into a minor, it wouldn't cost you in making the other your major, even if you took it later, things like that. But then you have to figure out what order to do that in, whether to start with engineering as the major or music as the major, whether or not to double major, and all these things. Then you have extracurricular activities, and it goes on and on. So you have qualitative, and then you have quantitative in terms of not knowing whether or not the intensities of the values represented by each activity are what you would have predicted. And then you also have, like, again, the people involved may not have had, there may be unpredictable factors or unpredicted factors that play a role. You've got to include whether or not the professor and the TA are a couple of jackasses, or whether or not they're honest men. There's only one class where both were found to be dishonest in all of my studies at the University of Texas at Austin. They know what I'm talking about. But in the case where this can be determined with, as it were, abstract and theoretical power that is also that is very strong because of its accuracy and its breadth and its applicability over a large scope. In other words, metaphysics. Enough that and one can scale that down to through heuristical applications. For example, forming templates of analysis from those to specific forms that handle cases, even down to rules of thumb. Once that's done enough, one can basically sort out this mess no matter what form it takes, as long as one has the goods to start with. If one doesn't, if one's this, then one's this being, and there's no hope. Because the only other beings that he has to work with are people in a hierarchy of ambivalence with him, who are basically just either greater or lesser versions of its own evil. It has no. There is a community of relation between them, which pretends to be we'll just leave it black, make it straight, because they're a little more honest with one another about what they're up to than they are to their marks. But in the case of their activity, there are layers, there are degrees of information control, so that at the higher levels there's more information released than at the lower, and it's intended that should always be diminishing to nothing, and there should be at least some unique information that is restricted, so that there is at the topmost level a sort of an interesting sort of ambivalence there as well, and that's required to be maintained throughout the existence of evil, because otherwise this hierarchical control, this chain of evil beings, cannot function as a group or systematically. And of course, in the praxeology, I'll highlight all the different methodologies that they use to carry on their evil activity, because that's the appropriate thing to do when uncovering these kinds of these kinds of activities and beings. And I'm doing this in the most general way. Notice I haven't named a single name in society, specified a single group. I'm talking about things as such and on the broadest scales of consideration, but in a way that's communicable through symbolic and methodological transformation into verifications of your own experience and common sense and personally conducted reasoning, which would speak for themselves. And if doesn't apply to you because you either are not handy with those, or just are against it, or just understand it, or in fact just one of these beings here, then or just confuse one of these beings, or whatever kind of being you are, it's beside the point to me. I'm making reasoned arguments. If you can't handle reasoned arguments, then it cannot be my concern. I'm only concerned for those capable of being warned to use their own judgment and recognize that they're responsible for how they relate appearances and substances. That's not the responsibility of anybody but them. They're the ones who decide whether or not to go further into these investigations and find out whose butt they've been kissing before learning to do even more filthy things with those people. Some people would be warned at that point. They can sense when their dignity and propriety is being insulted as such through them, and it's not just their ego. So in the case of understanding the way that evil mechanisms occur in the world, which is in the praxeology, I have to first demonstrate the general form in which good and evil relate in any world. And it's shown to be the mechanism of equivocation by which appearances that are fraudulent in the case of the confidence trickster evil being are yet presented in a reliably believable way toward a mark so as to appear to be what the mark interprets it to be and is allowed to interpret it to be and is even encouraged to interpret it to be. And this is the basis, the method of all fraud and of all crime, where direct force is not used as the primary modality or as the initial modality, or even as the final modality. Sometimes there's a crime committed by brute force, and then later there's a cover-up or a frame job so that all the roles of those involved can be confused with whatever story in the media or whatever group of lying stool pigeons and crony, clothesline crows, as it were, and they just lurk over a situation and curse it by their very presence. These blackbird types, these crows, these buzzards, these borderline carry-on. I mean, actually, I got to give it to a lot of blackbirds that eat fruit, but you can just tell that some of them, they just want to go over and become buzzards. They're leaning on becoming scavengers at any time, like crows. These types of beings are going to lie. They're going to systematically lie so as to pervert the truth so they can cover over their evil doings. And you're responsible for knowing that you're encountering something like that to the best of your ability. You just simply have to take responsibility for that. You should be aware that you live in a world where that might be happening just because of the fact that there's an idiom like this that goes back to ancient times and has universal appeal and significance. It's in every language. It's in every philosophy. Rather, every cultural tradition has a philosophy containing and enshrining principles that gravitate strongly in the orbit of, or in which this is found orbiting, as a significant principle. So it can't be denied. It just can't be denied. The only question is, how much severity are you looking at? Where in the system are you? What cases? It comes down to cases, but it also comes down to the case of the world. What world is it? Which possible world is it? I mean, it could be any of these for all you know, based on your cognitive dissonance, so you have an obligation to be sure of which it is. How would you know? Well, my approach, which is the most general and systematic, is to find out how I would know in any case what I was even talking about, and then to work that out in the form of the metaphysics. And then when that was resolved, the functional way to go in terms of exposition about the world, which became the later focus, because I realized that theoretical work was just going to be dragged on and subverted anyway. So I need to get down to brass tacks of what can be applied in cases for survival's sake, for the survival of sanity and life and limb and so forth. And in order to do the most good for the most people and provide the most help that I could when I wasn't getting pedicab rides or picking up and offloading donated goods from point of donation to the resale stores, things like that, before I was fraudulently thrown out of that work by an insurance fraudster, it turns out. committed insurance fraud against me. So that being the case, I've ended up in a situation where I've had more or less time to conduct the work, and I do so accordingly. But what I found is that the best use of the time is to get to the praxeology as soon as possible, but with a clearly laid structural format that explains that work coherently, so that it's not a bunch of, it doesn't look like a bunch of loose ends. It doesn't give the false appearance of being just someone's ad hoc aggression against the poor world and all of its phenomena, which are just, they're such a dictum. You know, how dare he take such a brutal brush and strike with such broad strokes at the world over whom Heraclitus cried. Well, you know what? He cried over it because he knew what a mess it was. And I take the approach of Diogenes where possible and command it to get out of my way while I pursue the truth and justice. And when it refuses to do that, I have to curse it and send it to hell. That's my religious duty fulfilled. But before I can do that, I have to be damn sure about what I'm doing, don't I? Just like you'd expect the Pope to be sure about his rhetoric when he accuses Trump of being a wall-building non-Christian, whatever all that's worth. I mean, that's like approaching the definition of man as being a featherless biped. You know, and if you're a chicken and you're trying to describe human beings, you wouldn't use features that held it in common with you, unless you wanted to risk Diogenes coming along, plucking you, and then throwing you into human society and say, go for it. That featherless biped is not sufficient. Wall-building non-Christian is a dangerous term to throw at Donald Trump whenever you're Pope Francis. And that sort of information is just bleeding through the world it's just everywhere. It's there to be taken. But most people just look the other way. It's like they're bought off on some deep level. How to assess those types of souls? How to assess the institutions which can be shown to be systematically in favor of this mass delusion, to where people cannot even pick up things like that, or even notice vote fraud when it's conducted right in front of them by Ted Cruz. Or just see the evil, cackling laughter of some people who want to have absolute tyrannical authority over you and to still vote for them. Wow, that's amazing. Well, you asked for it, they can say. You bought it. And I say, buyer beware. So given the conditions in which the world is, there can be no doubt that it deserves at least a thorough analysis so as to see which one it is, just because someone might want to strategize their spiritual life meaningfully through that world. There are all kinds of options which could be clarified by knowing exactly what world it was in which we live. It could be the spiritual equivalent of the ring of Gyges, which if you had the ring of Gyges, you could become invisible and thereby move through many dimensions of the world unhindered, which were before impossible for you. You could, as one evil man did, disguise yourself, make yourself invisible, sneak into the imperial quarters, assassinate the emperor, and frame somebody in the court, and have the new empress select you as the new, as they say, her accompaniment. I mean, that's what the evil man did. I believe his name was Gyges, or he lived in Gyges. It doesn't matter, but basically, in the old Greek story, crevice opened up in the earth from an earthquake, and he found a device that allowed him to do that, a ring, and he used it for that purpose, for evil means. Very evil man. Well, if I had that kind of information that was available through some type of Deus Ex Machina like that, I would use it to, do the best that I could to be the best person that I could in spite of all that, even if it was pit of hell. I mean, I'm not going to allow my circumstances to define me. I'm taking responsibility for my actions. But at the same time, the actions I take are in a context which is partly definitive of them. And and therefore they must be understood, and there must be at least a recognition of the fallout which results from actions when one is surrounded by people who misrepresent you. Just for example, I have freedom of speech. I don't have freedom from the consequences of my speech. I already accept that. And likewise, everyone has the freedom to do what they will. But they don't have the freedom from the consequences of the choices they've made. It doesn't matter if they think they're going to get away with it in this life or not. When your body ceases to function, you will know. You will know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if you live the wrong life, that you are in a lot of trouble. Your trouble has just begun. It's only just begun for you. And it's not going to be in such a positive tone when it happens. It's going to be in something that sounds like it came out of a Slayer album. So basically, whenever we're dealing with the consequences of the world in which we live, for our decision making in it, we perform our best due diligence when we resolve the fundamental cognitive dissonance concerning which kind of world it is, pertaining to the possibility of the expression of the ultimate values of human dignity and spirituality in all its best and truest forms, and therefore we're obligated to investigate these matters as accurately as possible, both empirically and logically, which I have done. Having done so, I wish to immediately start employing these methodologies and this information toward the ends of practical action, at least in the form of the exposition of these matters to others who may make the best use of them according to their nature and conscience, and whereas I may demonstrate by my action, my conduct, wherein the total scheme of things I stand, both to my own satisfaction and according to my own good conscience and judgment, and according to those who may be in a quite better hierarchy of being, the true chain of being, which should be called in fact the cascade of being, not the chain of being. Here's your chain. And in the cascade of being, which is real, the righteous beings definitely answer to their conscience and definitely do have a consistency within them that tells them that what they're up to is a good thing, and it's qualified by experiences that are subjective and of the essence of God's glory and cannot be taken therefrom, although their outer forms may be imitated and turned into a kind of stuffed, mummified version of the same in the form of public institutions that no longer have the virtuous people in them, which made their principles possible in the first place, and made their con artistry believable in the first place, because often they use the good cop to get the bad cop's agenda through. And in this case, we're not talking figuratively. We're talking literally. In the case of a world situation where it can be so fragmented, one must be aware of which one is in order to evaluate all of its phenomena or any of its phenomena accurately. And the more so, the more engaged one is with the world. Get that, Dr. D? Are you engaged? Are you engaged, Dr. D? Because I'm engaged. Are you engaged? So, in the presentation of facts about the world, and in direct proportion to one's ability to do so, one has the authority to do so and the obligation to do so simultaneously. Because one has the power, one has the obligation. And to demonstrate all those matters is a matter of political theory, which falls into, again, really the bridge between axiology and praxeology, because political agreements and associations are the most overarching domain of practical considerations that people can carry out before getting to the specifics of how they're going to continue with the rest of their private lives, insofar as any of that remains as a result of their agreements. But that will come after a firm analysis of the mechanisms of ambivalence, which regulate all forms of equivocation through means of duplicity. And the mechanism of equivocation, which enables it, the cause of it, is the fact that in fact duplicity is a fundamental nature of reality in this world, and it's only a matter of degree and in what sort. what kind of duplicity is taking place. And we'll get to that in the next video.